By 1865, the American Civil War had entered its final and most decisive phase. Union forces under the leadership of General Ulysses S. Grant had worn down the Confederate armies through relentless campaigns, particularly in the Eastern Theater. One of the most critical aspects of the Union strategy was the Siege of Petersburg, a prolonged campaign that ultimately led to the fall of Richmond, the Confederate capital. The Siege of Petersburg began in June 1864 and lasted for nearly 10 months, making it one of the longest military engagements of the war. Located just south of Richmond, Petersburg was a vital supply center for the Confederate capital. Grant knew that capturing Petersburg would cut off Richmond from crucial supplies, forcing the Confederacy into an unsustainable position. However, instead of launching a direct assault on the well-fortified city, Grant opted for a siege, encircling the city and cutting off its supply lines. Both armies dug in, constructing trenches that stretched for miles, foreshadowing the trench warfare that would later become common during World War I. The siege was marked by a series of brutal battles and skirmishes as Union forces attempted to extend their lines and tighten the noose around Petersburg. Confederate General Robert E. Lee, commanding the Army of Northern Virginia, knew that holding Petersburg and Richmond was critical to the survival of the Confederacy. But as the months dragged on, Lee's forces became increasingly stretched thin. Confederate resources were depleted, and Lee's army was suffering from desertions, shortages of supplies, and low morale. In March 1865, Grant launched a final series of offensives, including the Battle of Fort Stedman, a failed Confederate attempt to break through the Union lines. This marked the beginning of the end for Lee's army, as Grant continued to push forward. By early April, Union forces succeeded in breaking through the Confederate defenses at Petersburg. On April 2, 1865, Lee informed Confederate President Jefferson Davis that Richmond could no longer be defended, and Davis and his government fled the capital. Union troops entered Richmond on April 3, 1865, marking the fall of the Confederate capital. The capture of Richmond was a symbolic and strategic victory for the Union, signaling the collapse of the Confederate government. Lee's army, now in full retreat, was all that stood between the Union and total victory. After the fall of Richmond, Lee's remaining forces attempted to escape to the west in hopes of linking up with their Confederate armies. However, the Union Army pursued Lee relentlessly, preventing him from regrouping or reaching safety. Lee's army, weakened by months of fighting and lacking adequate food and supplies, was on the brink of collapse. Grant's forces, moving quickly, cut off Lee's retreat at a small village of Appomattox Court House in Virginia. On April 9, 1865, surrounded and outnumbered, Lee recognized that further resistance was futile. Rather than subject his men to unnecessary bloodshed, Lee made the difficult decision to surrender his army to Grant. The surrender at Appomattox Court House effectively marked the end of the Civil War in the Eastern Theater. The meeting between Grant and Lee took place in the home of Wilmer McLean, a simple farmhouse that would soon forever be associated with one of the most significant moments in American history. The terms of surrender were generous. Grant allowed Lee's men to return home with their horses and personal belongings, and he ensured that none of them would be prosecuted for treason. Grant's goal was to promote reconciliation and healing rather than punishment, recognizing that the nation needed to reunite after 4 years of devastating conflict. Lee's surrender was a moment of profound emotion for both sides. Many Confederate soldiers wept as they laid down their arms, while Union soldiers showed respect for their defeated adversaries. The surrender at Appomattox did not end the war immediately, as there were still Confederate forces fighting in other parts of the South. However, it marked the beginning of the end. Lee's surrender was followed by the surrender of other Confederate armies in the weeks that followed, signaling the disintegration of the Confederate war effort. Although the surrender at Appomattox is often seen as the symbolic end of the Civil War, fighting continued for a short time in other parts of the South. Confederate General Joseph E. Johnston, who commanded Confederate forces in North Carolina, initially attempted to continue the fight after hearing of Lee's surrender. However, with no realistic chance of victory, Johnston eventually surrendered to the Union General William Sherman on April 26, 1865, at Bennett Place in North Carolina. This surrender marked the capitulation of the largest remaining Confederate army. In Alabama, Confederate General Richard Taylor surrendered his forces to Union General Edward Canby in early May. And in early June, Confederate General Stand Watie, a Cherokee leader, became the last Confederate general to surrender his forces. The Confederate government, which had fled Richmond in April, attempted to regroup in the South. Jefferson Davis, still hoping to continue the fight, traveled southward with members of his cabinet, hoping to reach Texas and continue the war from there. However, Davis was captured by Union cavalry in Georgia on May 10, 1865, effectively ending any remaining hopes for a Confederate resurgence. As the remaining Confederate armies surrendered and Davis was captured, the Confederate war effort collapsed completely. The war that had divided the nation and claimed the lives of more than 600,000 soldiers was finally drawing to a close. The final battles and skirmishes of the Civil War, while smaller in scale compared to the earlier engagements, were still marked by moments of intense fighting and loss. For many Confederate soldiers, the end of the war brought feelings of despair and uncertainty about what the future would hold. For Union soldiers, their final victories were a culmination of years of sacrifice and perseverance. As Confederate forces laid down their arms, the long process of rebuilding the nation and healing the wounds of war began. Just as the nation was beginning to breathe a collective sigh of relief with the end of the Civil War, a shocking and tragic event occurred that would forever alter the course of American history. On the evening of April 14, 1865, just 5 days after Lee's surrender at Appomattox, President Abraham Lincoln was shot by the actor and Confederate sympathizer John Wilkes Booth while attending a play at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. Lincoln was attending a performance of Our American Cousin with his wife, Mary Todd Lincoln, and several friends when Booth entered the presidential box and fired a single shot into the back of Lincoln's head. Lincoln was rushed to a nearby boarding house where doctors attempted to save him, but the wound was fatal. The president died early next morning on April 15, 1865. The assassination of Abraham Lincoln was a devastating blow to the nation. Lincoln had led the country through its darkest hour, guiding the Union to victory and working toward a future in which the United States could be reunited and slavery abolished. His death plunged the country into mourning and left many wondering what the future would hold without his leadership. Lincoln's assassination was part of a broader conspiracy orchestrated by Booth and his associates to cripple the Union government. The conspirators had also planned to assassinate Vice President Andrew Johnson and Secretary of State William Seward, but their attempts failed. Booth fled the scene of the crime, sparking a massive manhunt that ended with his death at the hands of Union soldiers on April 26, 1865. While Booth's actions shocked the nation, they did not succeed in derailing the Union's victory or the process of Reconstruction that was just beginning. The impact of Lincoln's assassination on the nation was large. In the North, Lincoln was mourned as a martyr who had given his life for the cause of liberty and the preservation of the Union. Millions of Americans attended memorial services and processions in his honor and his funeral train, which carried his body from Washington, D.C. to his hometown of Springfield, Illinois, which was met by grieving crowds along the way. For many, Lincoln's death symbolized the high cost of the war and the sacrifices made to preserve the Union. In the South, reactions to Lincoln's assassination were more complex. While some Confederate sympathizers initially celebrated Booth's actions, many Southern leaders recognized that Lincoln's death would make the process of reunification and reconciliation more difficult. Lincoln had favored a relatively lenient approach to Reconstruction, aiming to bring the Southern states back into the Union quickly and with minimal punishment. With Lincoln gone, Vice President Andrew Johnson assumed the presidency, and his approach to Reconstruction would be marked by conflict and controversy. Lincoln's death left a deep and lasting scar on the nation. The man who had led the country through its greatest crisis was now gone, and the challenges of rebuilding the Union and ensuring justice for the newly freed African Americans would have to be carried out by others. The assassination also fueled bitterness and resentment in both the North and the South, complicating the already difficult task of healing the divisions caused by the war. The collapse of the Confederacy in 1865 marked the end of a long and brutal conflict that had torn the United States apart for years. The fall of Petersburg and Richmond, followed by Lee's surrender at Appomattox Court House, effectively ended the military resistance of the Confederacy. The final battles and skirmishes, along with the capture of Confederate President Jefferson Davis, marked the disintegration of the Southern war effort and the collapse of the Confederate government. While these events brought an end to the fighting, they also signaled the beginning of a new and challenging chapter in American history: the process of Reconstruction. The surrender of Robert E. Lee's army at the Appomattox Court House was a defining moment in history of the Civil War. It symbolized not only the military defeat of the Confederacy, but also the start of a period of national reconciliation. Grant's generous terms of surrender reflected a desire to heal the wounds of the war and to bring the Southern states back into the Union without excessive punishment. However, the assassination of President Abraham Lincoln just days later threatened to derail these efforts. Lincoln's assassination was a national tragedy that deeply affected the Union at a time when it was poised to move forward towards Reconstruction and reunification. The president's death at the hands of John Wilkes Booth deprived the nation of a leader who had shown great wisdom, patience, and compassion during the war. Lincoln's vision for a lenient Reconstruction designed to reunite the country without harsh reprisals would now be left to his successor, Andrew Johnson, whose approach would be more divisive and controversial. The collapse of the Confederacy was not just a military defeat, it represented the end of the Southern states' attempt to break away from the Union and preserve the institution of slavery. The war's end brought freedom to millions of enslaved African Americans, but it also ushered in a long and difficult struggle for civil rights and equality. The Union's victory ensured that the United States would remain one nation, but the question of how to rebuild the South and integrate formerly enslaved people into American society remained a deeply contentious issue. The final months of the Civil War, culminating in the fall of Richmond, Lee's surrender at Appomattox, and Lincoln's assassination, were among the most dramatic and consequential in American history. The events of 1865 not only ended the bloodiest conflict that the United States had ever experienced, but also set the stage for the complex and often painful process of Reconstruction. As the nation sought to heal the divisions caused by the war, the legacy of these events would continue to shape American society for generations to come. The surrender at Appomattox, the collapse of the Confederate government, and Lincoln's assassination were all pivotal moments that defined the end of the Civil War. However, the challenges of Reconstruction, the quest for racial equality, and the task of reuniting a divided nation would remain central issues of the post-war era. As the country moved forward from the devastation of the Civil War, it would be Lincoln's legacy of perseverance, justice, and unity that would continue to guide the nation through its most difficult moments.